Sony's Spider-Man universe with no Spider-Man has finally concluded with the Venom trilogy and the Kraven the Hunter movie nobody saw. We're going to take a look at why these three movies failed, and what was missing from all three of them. Stick around because we have a lot to go over. Okay. Say you're Sony Pictures. You're the smallest of the major studios, and franchise IP is what makes the world go round. As the superhero genre dominates cinema, your golden goose becomes the Spider-Man movies, which you thankfully own the rights to indefinitely. But there's a problem. In the post-MCU world, it's not enough to make a comic book movie and a sequel to that comic book movie, but that's all you have. You can keep making Spider-Man movies, but you have to expand. Keep the gravy train rolling. That's the same desperation that brought Sony to milk even more sequels out of Resident Evil, Ghostbusters, and Jumanji. Which brings us Desperation the Cinematic Universe. And thus, the Sony Pictures universe of Marvel characters is born. The Spunk. Oh god, that's a terrible name. Okay, the SSU was born. The Sony Spider-Man universe. Alright, that's fine. And let's start with something easy and recognizable. Venom. But Venom will be just the start. The Venom trilogy was a success, and the character doesn't suffer much from Spider-Man's absence. Yes, Venom does work as a solo character without Spider-Man. Venom has well over 300 solo comics where Spider-Man only occasionally shows up, and most of the time isn't even all that relevant. Venom has his own rogues gallery, his own supporting characters, dozens of storylines and pretty massive lore, and hundreds of storylines where the webhead doesn't even so much as get a name drop. And let's not pretend that comic book movies are even remotely interested in adapting comic book stories beyond a passing resemblance and periodic shared imagery, but the point is that Venom sells, regardless of Spider-Man. People like him enough on his own that he can make it to hundreds of comics with his name on the cover, which in turn means that those people will go see him in a movie theater, tell their friends about how much they love the character, collect his merchandise, cosplay as him, and encourage others to become fans of him. He's not some niche obscure character that's being given the limelight for the first time. Even if the vast majority of his adaptations don't understand the character at all and sometimes just fucking suck, the kids do indeed love Venom. He can carry his own movie. None of this can be said about Morbius, Kraven, or Madam Web. None of them have a fan base or general appeal even on the same planet as Venom, so they had way more to overcome in terms of getting butts into seats. The question then becomes why? Why did they choose these characters? What was the selling point? The hope for Sony was to mine the B, C, D, E, F, and Z tier of characters they had access to turn them into A-listers. There is a precedence for this. They wanted their Guardians of the Galaxy moment. And it's an interesting creative challenge. Take inspiration from the comic books and take a character that appears in only a handful of books and expand them into newer, more three-dimensional characters. The only problem is, it ended up not being that. Instead of expanding the universe, it shrunk. So let's take some time to explore the biggest missed opportunity in comic book movies since, well, a lot of people don't need to be convinced that Venom is awesome. They already think that. But Madam Web, the blind old clairvoyant lady in a big harness chair thing, needs a hook. The best Sony had was their Spider-Man adjacent. While Venom didn't need that push to be successful because people already knew that, these three definitely did. But then something went wrong in the process of making that happen. The biggest through line of this trilogy seems to be Sony getting a little too big for their britches and planning a more direct involvement for Spider-Man across these films, only to recant and cut his inclusion at some stage in development, leading to major issues with the films. Like, for example, Morbius having a really bizarrely fast second act and nonsensical post-credit scene, and Madam Web having major structural issues throughout the entire movie because they're seemingly cutting around a big character and having to redub dialogue very poorly to remove all references to him. Even apparently Venom 3 went through some of that too, extremely early on, with the most obvious piece of evidence being them directly setting up a crossover with Holland's Spider-Man before pulling back and ignoring that entire plot point. At least the pivot seemed to happen early enough there that it could still be a standalone movie without him like the previous two. These other three characters weren't that lucky. This is Sony's Spider-Man movie series with no Spider-Man. Alright, it's Morbin time. More BS. Have sex, excess, and any other memes. Get it out of your system now. There's not much to say about this one that hasn't been said already. It became the internet's collective punching bag. And Sony tried as hard as they could to be in on the joke, but we were laughing at them, not with them. In fact, I'm not terribly interested in mocking this one because there's nothing really new to contribute to that. The horse has been thoroughly beaten. Madam Web and Kraven, on the other hand, still have a lot of untapped juice. So if you don't mind, I'm going to try to take poor little Morby as seriously as I can. Mostly. Ironically, despite its reputation as being an embarrassing train wreck, I found this movie to be decently competent. It's not good, but it's got a beginning, middle, and end. Characters have clear motivations. Some of the action scenes of vampire on vampire violence are pretty slick. It isn't really bad in a funny way. No, instead it's just dull, and one of the biggest drawbacks are boring characters and flat performances. Jared Leto in particular is pretty bad in this movie and never feels believable delivering his lines. He reads every line pretty much the same way in conversation, so Michael Morbius just sounds like he doesn't care much.
I am gonna need your laboratory. You can keep all the money, all your little toys, just leave the sciencey stuff and that bag of spicy Cheetos.
He wants my lab.
So much for all that method acting and having people wheel him to the bathroom so he could stay in character while he's pissing. At least he didn't send used condoms and dead animals to Matt Smith. My dear boy, have you tried acting? Michael Morbius is dating the other main protagonist of Fortnite, not Jonesy, the other one. Morbius' love interest, Martine, is even more dull because they both talk to each other in bored, emotionless tones as they matter-of-factly read scenes that are supposed to be flirting while clearly feeling no attraction of any kind. Also, she apparently turns into a vampire too, but the movie has no time for this and doesn't follow it up. There are other subplots like these two bored cops chasing Morbius for murders that the villain committed, and they have this scientist guy who is kind of their shared father figure, played by Jared Harris, who is admittedly acting his ass off.
You're scaring me. Please, just calm down.
There's a decent scene near the end where he and Matt Smith are both desperately trying to make this script have some emotion, and I commend them both for their effort because they really upstaged Leto in his own movie. But even that's pretty short-lived because we don't have time to linger. Gotta set up Sinister Six, we just gotta! Every single subplot feels like a different movie. None of it works together, and none of the characters in the movie really interact with each other, just with Jared Leto. The story focuses on Dr. Michael Morbius using the fringe science of animal-human DNA hybridization to cure himself of a deadly blood disease. And the first half is a decently faithful recreation of his origin story, except it made two boats into one boat for simplicity's sake. Off the coast of Long Island, Morbius infuses himself with bat DNA and cures his fatal disease, but becomes some sort of science-based synthetic vampire. He can't be killed by sunlight or crosses or stakes or any of the other usual superstitious vampire weaknesses. He's pretty much a more powerful but more unstable version of Blade, the other day-walking vampire in Marvel, which is why he almost showed up at the end of Blade's movie debut. Even Morbius himself describes it as a quasi-vampirism. Something lost to time in the comics is that his face looked like that before he was a vampire. He just already had pointy ears and an upturned nose. Maybe that was part of his blood disease? But I actually think it's an interesting part of the character that he had a unique face that he was very at peace with. Even his fiancée and best friend both didn't mind because they liked him as a person so much. No Hollywood actor would agree to looking like that even in the scenes where he's a human, though, so instead Morbius looks like a handsome cult leader. The main antagonist is a composite of multiple characters from the comics because Morbius doesn't really have many decent villains, because most of the time he is a villain. Sony probably didn't have the rights to use Damon the Hell Priest from Arcturus 4. In his origin story, Morbo's childhood best friend was a fellow scientist named Emil Nikos that was helping him synthesize the cure, but became the first victim of his insatiable hunger for plasma. Later, the actual magic vampires raised Nikos from the dead because they hated Morbius for being like an impure half-blood something or other, but this was never followed up on. Morbius's guilt over killing his friend Nikos is a major part of the character that comes up really frequently in his books, especially some of the more recent ones. The movie instead changed that character to Lucian Crown, who is basically if Nikos was fused with a villain named Loxius Crown, aka Hunger, who is a Hydra scientist that Morbius mistakenly turned into another vampire one time. Matt Smith said he had a hard time researching for his character because Hunger really doesn't factor into Morbius's comics all that much, and Nikos is killed off before having any real character development. meaning he's a fusion of two different unrelated guys that have little to no material to really dive into. The fact that the source material itself is so thin on the ground doesn't have to be an issue. It could have allowed them to create whatever they want. Hell, comic book adaptations introduce new characters that end up in the books all the time. There was an opportunity here to expand on what was a pretty thin backstory to dive into a new side of this franchise. Maybe double down on the horror elements and give us an R-rated mystical vampire movie. But no, they went for reheated 2000s edgy superhero tropes. Even still, the film is mainly focused on the friendship between Morbius and Lucien, who he gave the nickname Milo when they were kids, for some reason. Milo suffers from the same blood disease as Michael, and in his desperation for a cure, he decides he's willing to overlook and eventually embrace the side effects of vampirism. Michael and Milo have an intense falling out over Milo's cavalier attitude towards killing and draining civilians to feed his thirst for blood, and the film ends with Morbius having to kill his best friend because he was too far gone. I'm sure on paper the emotions hit harder for this conflict, but it's not acted well enough on Leto's part to pull it off. They don't have great on-screen chemistry as friends, and we don't get enough scenes of them together to get fully invested in this relationship. I've never been a Doctor Who fan, but based on this, it feels like Matt Smith has way more charisma as a leading man than Leto, and maybe this movie would have worked better if they switched roles. Because Leto is more interesting when he's playing crazy, evil weirdos like in Blade Runner. If you paid close attention to the 2020 teasers, you might have seen that there were several scenes in here that didn't make the final cut. Something with Morbius jumping around in a brightly lit hallway in the daytime, like Nightcrawler from X2, a big sarcophagus that he lifts while testing his strength, the cop characters driving through the woods in the daytime and investigating a crime scene there. According to a leaked script from 2020 and some concept art, there was a whole subplot about Morbius acquiring a magic, semi-comic accurate looking version of his costume called the Blood Suit. It's not as obvious where these scenes were meant to be placed in the final cut, so they did a solid job of hiding most of the cutting room kerfuffles, with one big exception. Editing-wise, this movie feels pretty structurally sound despite the amount of things they cut out of it. It doesn't have that stink of constant re-edits all over it like Madam Web does. Some of that certainly happened, and you can tell, but it's not quite so clumsily obvious where the Spider-Man connections were ripped out. It still mostly functions on its own without feeling like half a movie. It's a solid, singular piece that's mostly pretty boring outside of a few decently animated fights. The big problem is that there's a big, gaping hole in the second act of the movie. Due to reshoots, a major sequence in the middle third was cut, and as a consequence, the movie doesn't build up to a conclusion through rising action like a normal movie would. Instead, like every other bad superhero movie, it's all set up, and then the finale happens, and nothing in the middle. Just like Venom 1. It's unsatisfying and frustrating, and it makes the movie really slow and dull. Morbius' original planned release date was July 2020, but it didn't come out until 2022, and that 2-year gap was full of issues. The trailers made it seem as if Morbius was going to meet Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, in prison. They'd work together and then presumably stage a prison break that allows Morbius to continue pursuing his friend-turned-enemy, and for him and Vulture to form a bond that will allow them to team up again in a theoretical Sinister Six movie. But the movie was delayed by 2 years because of something that happened in 2020. You may have heard of it. It was kind of a big deal. So in 2021, Michael Keaton was brought back in for reshoots. At the time, everyone speculated it was to add even more of him to the movie. But ironically, it was to justify having far less of him. Instead, Morbius busts out of his prison cell in a sequence that is completely CGI shots, and immediately finds Milo for their confrontation. No clever escape, no Michael Mando Scorpion cameo, he just blasts through the wall like Superman and flies to the third act. All of Vulture's scenes were cut from the middle of the movie. The result is a baffling post-credit scene where an unforeseen byproduct of Doctor Strange's spell in No Way Home accidentally displaces Vulture to the same prison in the Sony Marvel Universe. Then, even more baffling are the events that follow. For some reason, Morbius wants to meet up with the Vulture, and despite needing a team of engineers for technical support and building materials made from salvaged alien technology in the first place, Vulture somehow rebuilds an exact duplicate of his wings and costume to meet Morbius in this other universe. And then for some reason, he offers to create a Sinister Six League of Insidious Deadly Foes with Morbius, And for some reason, he's like, oh yeah, that would be sick. By the way, what's a Spider-Man? Michael Keaton seemed to be completely lost as to what he was doing and why during shooting, and remained professional and courteous while making it clear he thought Jared Leto was a weird douche.
And you know, he's such an interesting dude, you know? Like in the scene, you know.
Jared, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. You know, then I showed up and I said, oh, I get what he's doing. I'm going to steer clear.
Now that's a classy way to say that. What we can gather is that during principal photography, Sony was under the impression that their movies were set in the MCU. Then, in the combined turmoil of them almost splitting with Marvel over disagreements about the direction of the franchise, and the whole world kind of blowing up for a second, led to some uncertainty with the plan going forward and the release schedule. Sony and Marvel squashed the beef and renegotiated their deal and started to work on No Way Home and Let There Be Carnage, which both then established firmly that Venom was not from the MCU, which means neither was the heavily delayed Morbius, and we filmed most of it with the assumption that he was, even including a defaced poster in the background of the trailer connecting to Peter Parker's current infamy for being framed for murder by Mysterio. Gotta love how that set decorator was so checked out that they were told to put up a poster of Spider-Man and got a video game render of the wrong one, and then Sony gave so few shits about it clearly being the wrong costume that they left it all the way until the trailer. Sony then reshot several sections of this in a post-No Way Home landscape to try and make sense of it and make it as clear as they could that Morbius is not in Disney's pretentiously named Sacred Timeline. Having indirect ties to Spider-Man through his villains is one thing, but at least Morbius didn't have the man himself show up and then have to awkwardly cut around him despite being the crux of the whole plot. That would be a disaster. Just pause for a moment and address how awful this whole Spider-Man adjacent thing is as a way of establishing spin-off movies. Ideally, spin-off movies should work on their own. That was how the whole MCU thing started. None of these attempted cinematic universes remember that Marvel started off with a series of standalone adventures that then teamed up. They keep trying to put the cart before the horse. Why should we care about this big team up with Morbius and Vulture and whoever the fuck else if we don't actually care about Morbius? What's lost in Morbius is something to get attached to. Why should I care about this story? There's a solid first third of a movie in there that could have been good if the whole second act wasn't carved out due to disputes on whether it was in the MCU or not. Because there's no rising action or character development, it ends up feeling hollow and lifeless. The characters don't really interact or develop. Milo turns into an asshole, and everyone just reacts to it. There's a dozen different versions of this movie that could have been good somewhere along the line, but what we have is only okay at absolute best, if you're being super generous. Why not lean into the horror aspect? Make it a tragic Dr. Frankenstein or Invisible Man story. Lean into the monster movie aspect and show us more of Morb's torment and turning himself into a creature of the night, and his desperation for a cure. Shit, even the 90s cartoon knew how to do that better, and they chose to not include him drinking blood. I don't think the movie would have been magically fixed with the Adrian Toomes prison break scene put back in. Morbius needed to concentrate on its own identity instead of referencing another movie. Good thing Madam Web does that, but more. Bottom line on Morbius, the memes were fun, but the movie is not. Next! I'm sorry the Madam Web footage has to look like this, but it was blocked in every country every time I uploaded it for 6 straight times. Gotta love Marvel's war on old ladies. Compared to Morbius, Madam Web is a much harder sell, both creatively and to the audience. How do you convince people to buy tickets for a comic book character who's basically an old woman who sees the future? She can't even fight anyone. She's bound to sit in a chair on tenuous life support. How do you get an A-list talent to sign on for that? What do you tell the writers to write? At least with Morbius, he's technically a vampire, so you can just do a vampire story. There's bones you can expand on. Madam Web, you have to invent with whole cloth. Honestly, what they came up with isn't bad, at least in theory. Dakota Johnson, whose mother was in the Amazon researching spiders right before she died, said that she participated because she thought the idea of a superhero whose superpower was their brain was a pretty interesting idea. Think about it. Spider-Man is a smart guy, math, but if you're a hack screenwriter, he can always punch his way out of a problem. So can any number of other superheroes. How could you make a movie about a character like Madam Web, or even Professor X? You have to focus a lot more on their smarts and their relationships with other characters. There's a solid idea to do something different, except you hired a director mostly known for TV, the writers of Dracula Untold, The Last Witch Hunter, Gods of Egypt, Power Rangers, and Morbius. And you constantly breathe over their shoulders with heavy reshoots and an inconsistent vision of whether they fit into a larger cinematic universe or not. There's an interesting version of this movie floating somewhere in another Spider-Verse aside from our own. Think Final Destination meets Terminator, with the basic premise of, if you were a normal person and Spider-Man wanted to murder you, that would actually be scary as fuck, except every single creative decision is dumb and sucks. In the fun way to talk about, not in the fun way to watch. I wish it were funny bad, but it's boring bad most of the time, except when Cassie Webb repeatedly rams her car into Ezekiel Sims. A funny concession the movie has to make is that a normal human being can't beat someone with Spider-Man's powers in a stand-up fight, so the only way to make a dent is by running into him with a vehicle at 90 miles per hour. And even that's not terribly effective unless the guy with spider power isn't Peter Parker. It is instead a moron who dodges into even more peril because he sucks at using these powers. If the script were more clever, this could be really interesting. How do you deal with a superpowered villain as a regular person? And not a Batman-type regular person with, like, gadgets and decades of knowledge. Literally just someone on the street. Dakota Johnson, hating her life choices more than during any other film shoot except 50 Shades 3, stars as Cassie Webb. Her mother was in the Amazon researching spiders before she died. It's very important that we know this. Then Ezekiel Sims, her security guy, betrays and kills her to get magic-based powers from a rare spider that she discovered. Before she succumbs to her injuries, a native tribe with powers like Spider-Man save her baby and somehow get the baby back to New York without telling her any of what happened for some reason. Styling the natives with Spider-Man themed costumes was a terrible idea. Does this mean Peter Parker has been accidentally appropriating native culture? The implications of this are stunning. I'll talk in a moment more about the way this butchers JMS's story. Bear with me while I get through the plot summary part. Fast forward 30 years and a near-fatal accident awakens Madam Web's Madam Web powers, which consists mostly of Final Destination flash-forwards and the occasional astral projection. She boards a train to Ronkonkoma, New York City, people. Is this a real place? I don't know what. And it just so happens that 3 future Spider-Women are on the same train. We got the Colorado girl, whose costume was so cool that Peter's jealousy made an alien steal it. The first of at least 2 underage girls to kiss Peter Parker against his will. And the girl you unfortunately never see anymore unless it's a Spider-Verse team-up. Ezekiel Sims shows up to murder them because he has visions of them killing him in the future. Cassie half kidnaps, half rescues them, stealing a New York City taxi. Pay attention to this taxi. She uses it the whole movie and it never gets reported stolen or pulled over in New York City, which seems highly unlikely. Taxis have ID numbers in case of vehicle theft, but like a whole week goes by and nothing comes of this. Awesome. She then abandons them in the forest in New Jersey to look at some photo albums in her apartment 3 hours away, then rescues them only to abandon them again in a hotel room, then a third time at young Uncle Ben's house so she can go to Peru and learn about her powers for a whole week. Then the climax happens and she gets blinded after killing Ezekiel Sims. And then she's just Professor X. And none of the 3 Spider-Women have their powers yet. What a movie! Didn't that sound super exciting? It's a lot of Dakota Johnson giving the least enthusiastic line reads known to man and a boring exposition dump every 5 minutes. And while it's not necessarily ugly looking, it oozes cheapness. It feels like a feature-length CW production. Like episode 14 of a 24-episode season in a CW Arrowverse show. You know, like that kind of look. I guess I'll begrudgingly admit it has decent color grading, which in this era of film is somehow really rare now. My immediate biggest source of disappointment from this movie was the butchering of Ezekiel Sims, who is a far more complex and interesting character in J. Michael Straczynski's groundbreaking run on The Amazing Spider-Man from the early 2000s. Ezekiel is not a character that fits neatly into the category of hero or villain, and making him a ruthless Terminator means you have to strip away all of his personality to have him be a mustache-twirling bad guy. He's a flawed mentor that prepares Peter Parker for the most grueling and dangerous fights of his life against magical forces. He even nearly sacrificed himself to save Peter from the worst of them. But it turns out he did that because of a guilty conscience. He got spider powers nearly identical to Peter's through horrible means involving human sacrifice decades ago. And now all these magic monsters were descending on New York to take them away from him because he tampered with the natural order. So he used Peter as a sort of human shield to take the brunt of it because he's been in a lot of fights already. He betrays Peter for one last chance to save his own life, and then realizes he's only ever used his powers for selfish reasons, and then sacrifices himself in a final act of redemption to honor Spider-Man's heroism. This was not a character they should have used for this movie, especially not in the way that they did it. Instead, he's played as a selfish, purely evil guy with no redeeming qualities that would hunt and kill 3 high school girls instead of giving up his implied criminal enterprise. He keeps saying this, is that they'll destroy everything he's built. He says it so much.
I will not give up everything I've built and have my life cut short.
We never learn what that is. Is he a crime boss? Does he have a company like he's a CEO? Is he a politician? All I know is he has a nice apartment. Is he talking about himself because he's extremely built? I mean, he's in great shape. He looks like he's played by an actor 30 years younger than he's supposed to be. To make him more of a threat, they also poached the Mark of Cain and future-seeing powers from another, completely unrelated character. Even his costume is pretty derivative of Cain, who is Peter Parker's delusional, imperfect clone, who also becomes a redeemed hero. I'm noticing a theme of the characters they pick for these movies not having decent enough villains to use, so they have to mix and match from various sources. And in Ezekiel's case, he's a shallow, bland bad guy that's mashed up from 2 guys who aren't even strictly bad guys, with a lot more depth as characters. These are the kinds of things that make me so cynical about Hollywood adaptations of comics. It's always something that only vaguely resembles the thing from the comics, and it's executed so much worse and written in a dumbed down and lazier way, just for the character or concept to be wasted entirely and probably never adapted again for at least a few more decades. But we should be so grateful that our favorite stories and characters get filtered into garbage by the studio system to make someone who doesn't give a shit about any of this millions upon millions of dollars. It's such an honor and a privilege to see it all on the big screen, but so much worse every single time. We should be so grateful. The whole thing centers on a person that isn't very likable or interesting, played by an actress who clearly isn't enjoying her time here. So the title character is just a giant drag on her own film. He's a grouchy misanthrope who doesn't know how to have human emotions. The best moments in this movie, most likely unintentionally, are when Dakota Johnson makes a line delivery funny through sheer apathy.
But I don't have a neuromuscular disorder.
I would have made this movie about these 3 and left Madam Web out of it, or had her in a smaller supporting role played by an age-appropriate actress. Imagine Sigourney Weaver as the real Madam Web. Imagine if anyone working on this movie gave even the slightest molecule of a shit about any of this. You can make lesser-known, obscure comic book characters or silly schlock storylines into billion-dollar franchises, even without big-name Avengers characters appearing to prop it up. You just have to care. Millions of people all over the world cried for the story of a talking space raccoon. Even Sony knows this. Like, Spider-Man's spare costume he only wore for 11 issues of ASM just had its 3rd movie. There's no excuse anymore. You can make these things work. I've always liked Julia Carpenter in the comics because it was nice to have a superhero from Denver, Colorado, which is not too far from where I lived growing up. But much like the other 2, she's less of a developed character and more of a plot device here. Rather than use the original Madam Web fully, they pattern a lot of Cassandra's look in the film on Julia, since she later takes on the same mantle. Here's a red jacket, now you're a superhero. Eventually. Off screen. You know, she almost married Iron Man in the 90s cartoons. However, I'm just not sure why they decided to take 3 characters who canonically got their powers after Peter Parker, 2 of whom are sort of like sidekicks to him, and then made them 15 years older than him. At least. The movie never really does anything to justify this decision or clarify what their relationship to him will be going forward, presumably because they weren't allowed to show or talk about Spider-Man directly, and things like this needed to be cut. All we know is that at some point, all 3 of them will have similar powers and costumes to him, despite him being way younger, and they're a superhero team that Cassie kind of Professor X's for. Maybe Doom Patrol Chiefs as well. Can't believe I turned those into verbs. This movie is like if X-Men First Class got rid of all the bits about the X-Men and it focused on Professor X and Magneto finding the mutants, and instead of inviting them to form a team, he kidnaps them to the New Jersey wilderness next to a diner. Cinema. Everyone's costume looked decent for the 30 seconds we got to see them, though I wish they had done a proper opaque or mirrored Spider-Man lens instead of the open goggles look. Then again, Ezekiel would have had a harder time identifying them from his visions if their masks actually functioned like masks. So the costumes have to be worse for the movie to work. There were a lot of unintentionally funny things that happen as a result of the film's poor direction and wonky editing. Like Cassie Webb being unable to open any soda she picks up at multiple intervals. She's always holding a Pepsi that she fiddles with, but does a hand gesture before she can commit to untabbing it. Oh. No, never mind. Wait, no, maybe? No, never mind. Following the saga of the stolen taxi is really fun because the Bizarro reshoots force her to drive 3 hours out of the city, then 3 hours back into the city, then leave the taxi somewhere for nearly a week, then come back to re-steal it. And then of course there's everyone's favorite part, the wild amount of ADR. Nearly every line of dialogue spoken by Ezekiel is redubbed to clarify his motivations or have him state different ones, even if they're incredibly weak.
Now, but in the future, they have powers, and they will try to destroy me.
There are entire scenes in here cobbled together from pre-existing footage where they added new dialogue on top of scenes where characters are talking about God knows what else. Madam Web is the first time a movie adaptation has really touched on all the mystical destiny elements of Spider-Man lore. Every Spider-Person in the multiverse is bound together by a metaphorical web that dictates their fate and chooses who gets the spider powers, which are based on an arachnoid god creature that needs an avatar on Earth. It all starts to sound really confusing and Moon Knight-ish. I don't think it's ever been handled well by a writer since JMS, and even his run was really ballsy to replace the random sci-fi accident behind Spider-Man's powers with a magic, predestined, chosen one prophecy. But it's just told so well and written in such a compelling way that even if you don't agree with it, you have to begrudgingly respect it. It's just that all the magic stuff in Spider-Man became way more annoying and convoluted and even kind of sophomorically misogynistic after JMS wasn't the one making these rules anymore. And this movie has no idea what to do with any of it, so it's kept very vague and confusing. Likely because all of this is so squarely centered around Peter Parker and they cut him from the movie. There's a version of this movie that had Spider-Man in it somewhere along the line, possibly via time travel? There's a great video by Nando V Movies where he goes in depth with some of the weird editing choices to try to piece together a more clear picture of what Madam Web probably looked like earlier in development. I highly recommend you watch it for a more in-depth look at the bad editing choices on display in here and what they were trying to hide or change. But the general gist is that Ezekiel was most likely hunting Peter Parker's pregnant mother Mary in an earlier draft, which would have made this even more Terminator-like. Cassie's Spider-Girls were maybe intended to get powers from the Peruvian spider that Ezekiel had kept all these years, or maybe the spider was destined to be the one that bites Peter in 15 years after getting dosed with lethal radiation. It's not going to be entirely clear until we see the original script, and who knows if that'll ever happen. But this spider was meant to be more important beyond the opening. Ezekiel also has a guy in the chair that's very reluctant to help him chase down and kill these girls, and he treats her poorly enough that there was likely a dropped subplot about her standing up to him or switching sides in some way. And according to some of the official concept art based on an earlier draft of the script, a full-grown, fully costumed Spider-Man himself was meant to appear in the third act to fight Ezekiel. I think they maybe just saw some panels from Grim Hunt and said, that's our plot. But you couldn't have Kraven be the bad guy, so you just got some other guy who was in that book for one panel. The fact that Cassandra Webb is co-workers with Ben Parker and spends so much time hanging around his sister-in-law as she's about to give birth is strange in the final film. There are too many scenes involving this to cut out or cut around, and it was clearly an important plot point that was intentionally woven into this first act to pay off later in a big way. But now they do their best to ignore it in the third act, and it just kind of happens in the back there. She's very likely the reason the final car chase involves an ambulance, since she's going into labor at the same time this all goes down. Maybe she was in there and they had to cut around the shots that included her. Spider-Man is technically in this movie. They won't say his name, but there he is. He's like an hour old when you see him. Is that Tom Holland or Andrew Garfield? The timeline doesn't really line up for it to be either. And they weren't entirely sure themselves when they filmed this, but that's what we got. The movie ends up being Spider-Man's uncle's coworker has a really bad day in ways that are totally unrelated to Spider-Man. He's just in the background waiting to become twinkified ooh boy in the future.
Oh, Mr. Stark.
Do I think this movie would have been better if Spider-Man's involvement in the plot was left untouched? I don't know. It certainly would have been more cohesive and less silly and embarrassing for everyone in the cast. Maybe Ezekiel in an earlier draft was a better written character with more clear motives and more depth. And all of that was recorded over or cut out. The biggest question I suppose I have is why the other Spider-Women needed to be here at all if they don't have powers yet and Peter Parker was the original target. Maybe they assisted him in the future with fighting Ezekiel, but I don't know. They were wasted on this film either way, and I lament the fact that 3 really solid castings for these characters are going to go down the drain. I like all 3 of them as these roles, and in any other movie they could have been really cool. But this is a movie about boring things that happen a decade and a half before cool things. Cool things are coming, and they're not in this movie. That is the promise of Madam Web. No matter which version they made, it's so prequelized that it's a story that's almost not even worth telling. More than Morbius, it's hard to say what Madam Web could have been without Spider-Man from the beginning, but it could have been something. Embracing the Final Destination energy of a person fighting against fate and possible futures is cool. But that would have required the studio to come up with an idea that isn't just, Spider-Man shows up at some point. It's harder to imagine, but it's possible. Again, a complete failure of imagination from the top down. I can't believe someone paid $80 million to make something this ridiculous. So wait, Kraven gets an R-rated movie, but Venom does not. Alright. And with Kraven the Hunter, we finally get to the end of this tragic tale of avarice and stupidity. It truly is a tale told by an idiot signifying nothing. Morbius made a profit, kinda, which encouraged Sony to go full steam ahead on Madam Web and Kraven. It feels weird and wrong to say, but it wasn't Madam Web that killed the Sony Spider-Man spin-off universe, it was Kraven. 1 bomb you can write off, 2 bombs in the same year, harder to ignore. The true gift of this trilogy is that each film is bad in its own special, unique way. Somehow Kraven is both the best, worst, and most entertaining of the 3. Not only that, but it treats the comics like toilet paper. Except you stay. This is the one that actually made me mad watching it. The other 2 are boring and poorly made, and this one is too, but it's also the one with the writing choices that really irritated me. This time, it's personal. Okay, let's get some facts out of the way. Kraven the Hunter is a piece of shit. He's a bad person. He's a spoiled rich kid who grew up and started hunting and killing rare and exotic animals with his bare hands to prove how strong he is because he has a fragile ego. The ones he doesn't kill, he captures and sells to the zoo. He uses magic potions and rituals he appropriated from Africa to make himself a superhuman freak of nature that ages slowly. He has a ton of kids, so many I have a hard time keeping track of them all, and he was a bad father to every one of them. He's a petty, small-minded man that drove himself insane because he couldn't catch and taxidermize Spider-Man for several years. He's not an anti-hero with questionable methods but noble motives. He's not a protector of nature or a sympathetic and tortured soul. He's so far into the villain category that there's really just no chance you can take that material and spin it in his favor without having to completely reinvent the character in every way except visually. Which is why they did that. Of all 3 of these, this was the one I have the most issues with on a premise level. Morbius isn't all that bad of a guy. Madam Web is an outright heroic character. But Kraven doesn't have redeeming qualities to zero in on when making him the main character. Which means you have to butcher the comics even more than in those other ones to even try and make this work. The only version of Kraven that's not an evil maniac is the MAU version from the 90s. But the magic serum that gave him his powers made him into a crazed stalker until they cured him. Of course, this movie bears almost no resemblance to that version at all, but I figure it was worth a mention. The movie version has to be a globe-trotting, super-powered Russian version of the Punisher who kills human traffickers and works as an animal preservationist. difficult to make a movie about a character who is so inherently evil because the general audience of blockbuster cinemas need a hero to root for and don't want to follow a scumbag the whole way through. You can absolutely make a movie about a really bad guy doing bad things, but those aren't necessarily huge crowd pleasers that rake in hundreds of millions of dollars. You can't make an action movie of this scale with a character audiences simply do not empathize with because he's too much of a monster. Not even the other R-rated superhero movies can get away with that. Even Deadpool had to have his rough edges filed down for general audiences to stomach. So Blind Al is his roommate, instead of an old lady he kidnapped and holds hostage and occasionally puts in a torture room. And I understand that. If you need to root for the character, he can't be completely irredeemable. So if you have a character that is so unlikable and so unsympathetic, but you know you can't portray him as such for the movie to work as intended, you'd have to completely change him. And that begs the question, is this a character you should even bother making the main character of a movie? Is it worth it to make this character the hero if you have to completely throw away everything about him to make that work? No. Kick-Ass got his ass kicked, Quicksilver was too slow, and Kraven couldn't hunt his way out of a paper bag. Kraven stars Aaron Taylor Johnson as his final shot at a superhero role working out. Oh boy. Kraven the Hunter is a wealthy young son of a Russian crime lord who was given a mystic serum after a hunting accident that made him superhumanly fast and strong. Even more superhumanly fast and strong than in the comics, but whatever. It's like they had to juice him to make him the main character. I don't know how or when to bring it up, but movie Kraven has an implied telepathic ability to control animals like a land-based Aquaman, and they show it multiple times without really going into it, so there's that too. After abandoning his family and with his newfound powers, he hunts and kills criminals that associate with his father. One of his potential targets decides to preemptively strike back at Kraven by kidnapping his beloved younger brother. Now Kraven must save his brother, who he gets drunk with once a year and the movie pretends that means they have a strong bond, kinda hang out with a girl that he has no chemistry with, be a really toothless and soft R-rated movie, and mean mug at his dad, who would have been a way better casting for the title character 15 years ago. I was never happy with Aaron Taylor Johnson in this role from the very start. He doesn't scream Kraven to me in any way. It's like they said, oh yeah, he's got dark hair and a beard, that's all you need. Kraven is this massive beast of a man that can wrestle bears and crush Spider-Man's body. Aaron Taylor Johnson is male model ripped, but that character should be WWE ripped. Johnson doesn't have the same imposing presence, and his voice is so soft sounding. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's clearly been taking his shots, he's shredded, but he's just so tiny. He doesn't even have a Russian accent. Russell Crowe plays his father, and he's much closer to my idea of a real-life Kraven if he was younger and in better shape. This movie should have come out in 2010, directed by Sam Raimi, with Kraven's Last Hunt as the second half of the film.
Hey, you're gonna do it like I tell you to do it, you can get off the set.
Let's bury Toby alive for real. It'll be great. The main villain is the second horribly embarrassing attempt at bringing the Rhino to live action. He's a character with no attachment to Kraven at all, but his name is Russian, so I think they just decided to go with that. Despite modeling him to look more like the Ultimate Comics character Alex O'Hearn, this is still Alexei. Instead of an Iron Man suit, Rhino is some kind of genetically enhanced mutant man who turns into a terrible-looking CGI Rhino Man if he isn't hooked up to this IV in a comically small backpack. This looks like a child's backpack. He looks like a grown man dressed like a nerdy 5th grader. He's gonna take you back to the past to play the shitty games that suck ass. Oh wait, he's an example of that weird trope in comic book movies. And he makes this noise at one point.
Nikolai is a tough old bear.
I found someone in New York, a biochemist,
But Professor Miles Warren.
developing a procedure to increase strength tenfold.
I guess they just took a name out of a hat and decided Miles Warren can be a superpower factory for villains in this movie, despite that not being his field of science at all. They must have seen the Spectacular Spider-Man episode where he turns Kraven into a Thundercat while researching for this movie, because it's always easier to watch the cartoons than read a comic, and then just assume that's what the character is all about, like that's his whole gimmick.
genetically altered to combine traits from multiple species.
You can do that?
It's not like they're ever gonna touch the clone shit for real, so whatever. At least Rhino didn't get his powers from Oscorp's R&D department, which was an inexplicable assembly line for Spider-Man villains. Imagine if we actually got that Sinister Six? Oof. Once again, it's easier to pull concepts from the most recent cartoon than to make the character even remotely resemble their original iterations. Hollywood will kiss Stan Lee's ass until the end of time and pay him lip service as some kind of creative super genius, but their faces would melt if they ever had to crack open an omnibus and read something he actually wrote dialogue for. What's weird is that the secondary antagonist is obscure Marvel villain The Foreigner, but unlike Rhino, they get him 100% right. Would have loved to see that energy with Rhino, but it's better than nothing, I guess. He's not a particularly huge character in Spider-Man lore, but for some reason, the adaptation of him in this movie is nearly perfect. It's been years since I've seen a character in one of these movies who felt so much like he walked off the page. They cast an actor who looks just like how he's drawn, he talks like him, he dresses like him, he has a perfect live-action representation of how his powers work. When he makes eye contact with someone, he can hypnotize them for a few seconds and move around while they're entranced, which gives the illusion that he's super fast or can even teleport. He's like an actually cool villain that's fun to watch. And while his motivation for battling Kraven is flimsy, he still has such a commanding presence. Whenever the Foreigner is not on screen, all other characters should be asking, "Where is the Foreigner?" Shit, maybe the movie should have been about him. Or at the very least, he should have been the big bad and Rhino should have been the muscle that he hired for protection against Kraven instead of the other way around. You know, because Rhino is like the hired help who beats people up for money and not the boss. The Foreigner uses these psychotropic drugs to confuse and discombobulate Kraven, and he's just more of an intellectual villain. If Kraven genuinely faced off against him instead of the Rhino, maybe he would have had to confront his own fears and insecurities to beat him instead of just fighting a big guy covered in gray CGI sludge. Imagine that. Character development. What a concept. This movie's version of Rhino is such a boring dork. Why is he calling the shots? What happened here? Why is this obscure nobody character from the 80s the most faithful on-screen adaptation of a Spider-Man villain ever put to cinema? And he's in this movie for like 5 scenes and then gets abruptly killed off? I'm completely befuddled. Kraven is the lightest on Spider-Man connections of the 3 of these, and I think they must have finally learned their lesson after having sabotaged 2, maybe 3 movies in a row to backpedal their decisions. So this one is self-contained from the start, minus a scene where the Foreigner makes Kraven see his greatest fear and he starts seeing spiders. They really don't establish that he has a fear of spiders before this in any capacity, but apparently he and his mentally ill mother share some kind of extreme arachnophobia to the point that it's paralyzing. This is just some random throwaway to have a shot of spiders in the trailer and evoke the hallucination scene from J.M. DeMatteis' Kraven's Last Hunt. Don't you love when comic book movies show imagery that vaguely resembles a panel or cover from the comics but completely divorced from their original context and meaning, but they still expect you to point and soy face out because it looks like a thing you saw before in a Google search, but you've never read it, so it doesn't matter that the entire point is lost because you never knew that to begin with. So you can post a side-by-side comparison on Instagram and say it's comic accurate for the most mind-numbing superficial shit ever? I sure do. My grouchy comic book elitism is showing again. I'm sorry, it happens. I can't control. Of these 3 movies, Kraven is the only one with an association with some kind of iconic imagery, so this was bound to happen, but this one is really out of left field and just kind of try hard. One of the most interesting elements of Kraven's history is his complicated and somewhat adversarial relationship with Chameleon. Chameleon and Kraven share a father, but not a mother. Nikolai Kravinoff had an affair with Sonya, one of his servants, that resulted in a second-born son, who he was ashamed of. Dmitri was raised under the last name Smerdyakov and kept near the Kravinoff family, but was told he was just Sergei's servant boy. Kraven knew he was his brother and treated him like garbage for it, abusing him and constantly asserting his superiority over him for their entire childhoods. It wasn't until Chameleon was much older and after Kraven had died that he'd finally accepted the truth that he and Kraven were brothers, which he had suppressed for so much of his life because of the physical and mental abuse of his father and brother. Despite Kraven treating him so poorly, Dmitri desperately wanted his bigger brother's approval and tried extremely hard to emulate him. fighting for the approval of someone who just does not love him. It's a really toxic dynamic that drives Chameleon to madness as an adult. The movie version doesn't want to portray Kraven as a cruel person, so he's a kind, loving big brother, and Dimitri is much more accepted into the family, even getting to carry the Kravinoff name. The movie implies Kraven watches out for Dimitri by visiting him every year on his birthday. Nikolai clearly respects him less than Sergei, but he doesn't outright reject him the same way and still acknowledges him as his real son.
Perhaps it's the Tsar's illegitimate half-brother, like your Dimitri.
Leave the boy. He carries no blame for his father's wandering eye.
So, like, you have all this juicy family drama baked in, and they decided to simplify it and give Chameleon way less reason to become a villain than his comic counterpart, and then have him become a villain anyway. It's like they make changes to these things without realizing that it hurts their goals. Just changing shit for the sake of it with no real thought behind it. Jesus! There's so much more material here to work with regarding Kraven's history and his family than either of the other two movies really had. He has several complex and fully fleshed out relationships with other characters that they decided not to use. It's not like they were scraping for anything to turn into a character like Morbius was with Lucian. Everything they needed was already mapped out for them. Most of it by only one writer too, so it was really consistent. And they just didn't go for it. It's like they just skimmed the Wikipedia article instead of looking at any of this for inspiration. Which they probably did, let's not kid ourselves.
Look at what you became.
What the hell was that? Did you see that? The scene where Calypso and Kraven talk at his base has this really jarring edit where they needed a pickup shot of her saying this line but didn't have footage for it. It seemed to cobble it together by photoshopping other elements from other takes. She has a floating mouth like the annoying orange. Now that's balls on a filmmaker. Unlike Madam Web and Morbius, whose problems stem from bad writing and endless edits and reshoots, I think this movie's problems stem almost entirely from just bad writing. With the other two, it's hard to tell because they kept overwriting and changing so many things in editing that it doesn't really resemble the original script anymore. But this one is edited mostly normally and just has a bad script. This thing sucks by design. The pacing is disastrous. The first act of this movie is an hour long. There's so much setup and setup and setup. Then Dimitri gets kidnapped and the second act is like 20 minutes long. And then we just rush straight into the big finale. Too many threads are introduced and none of them are really dealt with in a satisfying way.
Now I'm in London, at one of the biggest law firms in Europe.
I know where you work. You're one of the best investigative lawyers in that place.
And the dialogue is somehow worse than Madam Web and Morbius.
Well, you're gonna need a lawyer, or worse, if you keep messing around in this world.
What? What's worse than a lawyer? An accountant? A priest? What does that fucking mean?
Shit. There are 5 guys walking into my building right now who do not look like they belong here.
What do you mean those 5 guys don't look like they belong here? They're wearing business suits and walked into an international law firm in a big office in downtown London. Or are they supposed to be wearing clown suits?
Welcome to the final show.
The way you wear your hat.
He can do anyone. He's like Chameleon.
Oh, come on! I know what you're doing, and it doesn't even make sense in this context. Dimitri does vocal impressions. Chameleons look like other things, not sound like other things. If anything, you should be calling him a parrot, you fuck. And all this dialogue seems to be read as written. These aren't lines added in ADR as far as I can tell. This script was just actually written like this. Could a human being actually sit down and explain some of this dialogue to me and defend why they wrote it this way? Did fucking ChatGPT write these lines? As a movie, it ostensibly claims to be a gritty crime drama. The Godfather, but dumber and with superpowers. It's a family drama about a shitty father and the way his sons deal with the unfair expectations he puts on them. Except it sucks at being that too. Kraven is in angry and taciturn mode the whole movie. Once we flash forward from young Kraven to grown man Kraven, he never opens up, becomes vulnerable, or admits what's really going on with him. He takes Calypso to his lair in Russia near the end, and even then, instead of diving into his character development, they have a dumb CGI fight with a cartoon snow leopard to show off how awesome he is and how in tune with nature he is. It's funny how the movie feels approximately 3 centuries long, but no character is given more than 1 or 2 scenes to develop them. Everyone just kind of acts the same way through the entire thing, which is why it's even more jarring when Dimitri completely flips on Kraven off-screen. Because these movies always make the same false assumption that they'll be getting sequels, Dimitri decides that he hates his brother now for killing their father. So he got CGI superpower surgery from the never-on-screen Miles Warren, and instead of being a master of disguise with realistic silicone masks like Mission Impossible or a holographic image inducer, he can morph his face like a male version of Mystique. I know he paid to become a shapeshifter in the comics later on too, but I'm sad they completely skipped that middle step with him doing the impersonations as a craft, with clever quick-change costumes and masks. Again, weird how they chose to adapt one minor character super faithfully, but no other. While it's boring and at times funny for casual viewers, Sony Pictures' Kraven the Hunter is baffling for anyone with an understanding of the character it's based on, and I think I've cracked what feels so weird about it. This movie feels like a movie that could exist within the Marvel Universe as a biopic that was executive produced by the Kravinoff family estate as a pro-Kraven propaganda piece that they had final approval on the script for. This movie would be released a decade after his suicide as a way to sway public opinion in the Marvel Universe about Kraven. Oh no, Kraven actually loved animals and was a preservationist. He's like a super-powered Kevin Richardson.
Because we can.
Because you can?
He would violently assault poachers if he saw them. He wouldn't do that kind of thing. He wears a lion head vest because it was a lion he had a special connection with that his evil father killed. And now he wears it to honor that noble lion that saved his life. Kraven loved his illegitimate half-brother Dimitri.
I love you, man.
And always visited him on his birthday and supported his musical career. Kraven has a strict code of honor and would never break his own rules or act like a hypocrite. This movie goes to such lengths to portray him as an anti-hero that it just feels like it's full of lies. And you know what? I figured out why this one makes me angry. Morbius and Madam Web had very little material to work with and hardly any stories they could adapt, so they had to come up with mostly original stuff to fill in all the gaps, and it's hard to hate them as adaptations when they're inventing so many new things to tell their story. They're not good new things, but at least they're not butchering tons of great material. However, Kraven has this expansive, fully developed history across so many books, all written by mostly one writer, J.M. DeMatteis, who's one of the best in the business. And they opted not to use any of that and approach it the same way they did with the other 2 movies, which was mostly just making up random stuff with a passing resemblance to the source material. They had all the work done for them to make some really compelling character dynamics and have a really complex history for this evil character. But they threw it all out to write a generic by-the-numbers action movie about a boring anti-hero and his boring family who aren't nearly as evil as they should be either. If you're going to make a movie about characters who are assholes, then commit to making them assholes. This movie isn't missing Spider-Man all that much, but it is sorely missing Kraven the Hunter. This guy is not that guy, as the box office has told us. Maybe it's for the best that Sony decided to hit the brakes on this train. Each one of these is an embarrassment in its own special way, and they make less money each time they come out. The Venom trilogy wound down and left on kind of a low note, but at least they got that far. None of these are going to get a sequel. None of these characters are going to form a team, and they're most certainly not ever going to be in the same room as Spider-Man. I just hope this failed experiment hasn't tainted these characters to such a degree that they can't be used again for real in a different movie with different actors by a more competent writer and director. I'd hate for these guys to all become untouchables like Green Lantern for 15 years or more. I just don't want to see these versions of them ever again. Maybe other people got a lot more ironic enjoyment out of these, but I didn't feel that way. I was just sad. It's not over yet, though. Spider Noir is on the way, starring Nicolas Cage as Ben Reilly, apparently. No. It's not like Sony would ever stop making Spider-Man movies. According to an article in Variety, the bigwigs at Sony will never stop milking that golden goose. Neither will I. Instead, their takeaway is to focus their future Spider-Man movies on Spider-Man. Just make one good movie at a time and think about their next movie after that. Who would have thought? And as much as that makes sense, from another perspective, it's kind of sad. It's an interesting idea to take the side characters from stories starring more popular heroes and give them time to shine. But instead of doing that, constant meddling from a studio that didn't know what they were doing and a complete lack of faith in the characters themselves meant falling back on tired tropes, weak screenplays, and one or two famous people desperate to get in on that comic book cash. This could have been an opportunity to try new things in the comic book movie space, but it ended up being a monument to corporate hubris from a bygone era. I don't think the memes will be these movies' only legacy. Variety mentions that this whole Spider-Man without Spider-Man cinematic universe was conceived of back when comic book movies like Infinity War and Endgame were just printing infinite money. The movies themselves came out in the post-pandemic era where putting Marvel or DC in the title didn't guarantee $1 billion anymore. Audiences got wise while the executives drank the Kool-Aid. It's hard to make accurate predictions about where the movie industry will go as a whole, but at the time of writing, a Marvel movie is struggling to match an original R-rated vampire movie at the US box office. Clearly, things are changing. Whether that's a good or bad thing is more of a matter of perspective. But the Sony Spider-Man without Spider-Man universe is a time capsule, late to a party that it wasn't invited to. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and point and laugh, I guess. I always get mad at YouTube for not putting my videos in the subscription box because people will comment, "Finally, Xavier uploads again after all these years," not knowing 3 other videos came out within the last month already. So maybe that stupid bell icon thing will help you remember I exist. If you want other ways to support the channel, you can always go hit up that Patreon for early videos and exclusive stuff because it's just $1. I'm not kidding, it's only $1. Isn't that cool? If just 5% of the people subscribed to me donated only $1 a month, I could make videos even faster and keep my house. You can also check out our merch on TeePublic, or just buy some of my random stuff on eBay. I have a pretty substantial collection of old toys that are still in the box in perfect condition, so go take a look in case you find something you like. And lastly, since this is a YouTube video and you probably play Fortnite, drop my creator code XavierGM next time you buy a silly dance or a cool character skin. Really helps me out. See you next time!